Sometimes the greatest love stories do not begin with a kiss. They begin with dust, hunger, silence, and two wounded souls forced to stand on the same side of a war. Caleb Harding was a man trying to save his dying ranch. Margot Calloway was a woman carrying the hopes of the forgotten in a worn leather bag. Neither of them was looking for love. But out on the Texas frontier, where danger rides hard and words come slow, hearts can be changed by shared labor, quiet sacrifice, and the courage to stay. Listen closely, because this story is not just about survival. It is about the kind of connection forged in fire.
August in Crockett County isn't a month, it's an anvil. The sun doesn't just shine, it beats you down. It bakes the moisture out of the dirt, out of the air, out of your bones. Caleb Harding lifted the post-hole digger, dropped it. The iron bit into the baked Texas earth with a dull, heavy thud. He paused, wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes, looked down the fence line. 40 posts left. No hands to help, just him, a dying ranch, and a shadow that stretched further than the setting sun. A shadow shaped like a number, $4,200, owed to the First Territorial Bank, due in 90 days. If he failed, the land was gone, the water was gone. The Crockett Water Syndicate was waiting like vultures on a fence wire, ready to pick his family's legacy clean. He lifted the iron again, dropped it, thud. Then the sound of hooves, steady, unhurried. Caleb didn't reach for his rifle, but his hand hovered near his hip. He turned, a lone rider coming from the west. The dust settled as the horse slowed. Caleb squinted through the glare. It wasn't a banker, it wasn't a syndicate thug, it was a woman. Margot Calloway didn't look like she belonged in the dirt and the heat, but she didn't look afraid of it either. Her clothes were functional, worn, dusted from a long trail. Her eyes were sharp, searching. She didn't dismount right away. She looked at the land first, not the house, the soil. Only people who understand dirt look at the land before they look at the man. Then she looked at Caleb. "You Caleb Harding?" "I am." She swung down from the saddle. No wasted movement. She walked straight up to the fence line, pulling a folded piece of paper from her heavy coat. "My name is Margot Calloway. I rode in from Santa Fe." Caleb didn't say a word, just waited. The wind kicked up, hot and dry. "I know about the debt," she said. Her voice was calm, steady. No pity in it, just a statement of fact. $4,200. You have exactly 90 days before the syndicate takes this place. Caleb's jaw tightened. "News travels far. Desperation travels farther," she replied. She held out the paper. "I'll pay it, in full, tomorrow morning in cash." Caleb stared at her. He didn't take the paper, he didn't blink. "I'm not selling my land." "I don't want your arable land," Margot said. "I don't want your house, I don't want your cattle." She pointed a gloved finger toward the north, past the dry ridge where the green still clung to the earth. "I want the mineral spring, just the deed to the water. And I want it opened up." Caleb frowned. "Open to who?" "Everyone." She didn't look away. "The Mexican families on the border road, the indigenous camps out west, the dirt farmers the syndicate squeezed dry, anyone who needs to drink, anyone who needs to heal, free and unrestricted access, forever." Caleb stood silent. He knew what the syndicate wanted that water for. Bottling, selling, bleeding the county dry. If he gave it to her, if he made it public property, the syndicate wouldn't just be angry, they'd be lethal. But looking at her standing there in the dust, he saw something heavier than fear. He saw a duty she carried like a stone. "That's a good way to get us both killed," Caleb said quietly. "It's a better way to live," she answered. Caleb took off his hat, dusted it against his thigh. He looked at the unplanted fence posts, then at the banknote still hovering in her hand. He shook his head. I don't take charity, and I don't take unearned money. Margot's expression didn't change, but her shoulders dropped a fraction. She turned back toward her horse. But the words stopped her in her tracks. Caleb stepped forward, leaned his forearms against the top rail of the fence. You want to survey that water? Make sure it flows the way you think it does? You can stay 3 months. Margot turned slowly. I need a hired hand, Caleb continued. His voice was flat, strictly business. Room and board, $6 a month. You do the work, you get your time at the spring. We don't ask about each other's pasts. It wasn't an invitation, it was a test. A wealthy woman from Santa Fe, offering thousands of dollars, wouldn't shovel manure. She wouldn't mend fences in the blistering heat. Margot looked at the dirt, looked at the unfinished fence. She walked back to him, held out her hand. Done. One word, no haggling, no complaints. Caleb looked at her hand, calloused, small but steady. He took it. The sun finally dipped below the ridge, throwing long, dark shadows across Harding's Hollow. 30 men wanted that land. 30 men wanted that water. But right then, standing in the fading Texas heat, Caleb Harding had already made his choice. 4 in the morning in Texas isn't a time, it's a state of grace. It's the only hour the earth forgives you. The heat hasn't woken up yet. The wind is still, holding its breath before the sun sets the plains on fire. Caleb Harding struck a match against the iron stove. The flame flared blue, then orange. He touched it to the kerosene wick. He put the coffee on. Black, bitter, strong enough to float a horseshoe. He didn't hear her come in, but when he turned, Margot Calloway was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She had taken the old tack room attached to the barn. He hadn't offered her the house. She hadn't asked for it. That was their first unspoken rule. Space. You keep yours, I keep mine. She was dressed for work. Heavy denim, a canvas shirt, boots that had seen miles of hard trail. Caleb poured a second tin cup of coffee. He set it on the rough oak table, pushed it toward her. She took it. Morning. Morning, he said. That was the extent of their conversation. They drank in silence. It wasn't a heavy silence. It wasn't the awkward kind you get in town where folks are trying to figure out what to say next to fill the gap. It was the silence of two people who knew that words cost energy. And out here, you don't spend energy you ain't got. When the cups were empty, they went to work. Barbed wire is mean. Some call it the devil's rope. It doesn't want to be tamed. It bites. It coils back. It snaps. If you don't respect it, it will lay your forearm open to the bone. Stringing it takes 2 people. One to pull the stretcher tight, the other to drive the iron staples into the wood. Caleb took the stretchers. He clamped the heavy iron jaws onto the wire, leaned his weight back, pulled. The wire sang, a high, tight twang echoing over the scrub oak. Staple, Caleb grunted. Margot stepped up. She placed the U-shaped iron over the wire against the mesquite post, raised the hammer. Whack, whack, driven deep, held tight. Release, she said. Caleb let off the tension. They moved to the next post. Clamp, pull, twang, whack, whack. You learn a lot about a person when you work a fence line with them. You learn their rhythm. You learn their temper. A careless man will jerk the wire trying to force it. A weak man will let the tension slip. A proud man will swing the hammer too hard and bend the staple just to prove he can. Margot didn't do any of those things. She found the rhythm. She matched Caleb's pace, step for step, post for post. By 10 o'clock, the grace of the morning was gone. The Texas sun climbed up into the sky like a brass coin. The heat rolled off the dirt in shimmering waves. 102 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. The smell of the prairie rose up around them. Crushed sage, dry alkali dust, hot leather, and the sharp metallic tang of their own sweat. Caleb wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He looked over at Margot. Her canvas shirt was soaked through at the spine. Her face was flushed dark beneath the brim of her hat. He looked down at her hands. Leather gloves only do so much against fresh barbs. The wire had slipped an hour ago, caught her right palm. He saw the dark, wet stain seeping through the brown rawhide. Most town folks would have quit right there, held up the bleeding hand, asked for a bandage, asked for water, asked to sit in the shade. Margot didn't ask for a damn thing. She had just pulled a red bandana from her back pocket, wrapped it tight around the glove, tied a knot with her teeth, and picked the hammer back up. Whack! Whack! Caleb watched her for a long moment. He didn't say good job, he didn't say take a break. He just nodded, once to himself. Respect isn't bought out here. It's earned in the dirt. Dusk. The sky bruised purple and orange over the western ridge. The day's work was done, or so Caleb thought. He was sitting on the porch step, working a tin of saddle soap into a stiff leather bridle. His shoulders ached. Good ache. Honest ache. He looked up, saw movement by the well pump. It was Margot. She was filling 2 large wooden buckets, heavy ones, 3 gallons apiece. Caleb stopped rubbing the leather. He watched her. She didn't carry the buckets toward the barn, didn't carry them toward the house. She turned her back to the yard and started walking out toward the property line, toward the public dirt road that cut through the valley. Caleb set the bridle down. He stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, leaning against the wooden pillar. Down on the road, a wagon was moving. It was a dilapidated thing, a mule that was more ribs than meat pulling it, a Mexican family. A father walking alongside, a mother and 3 small kids in the back, sitting among rolled-up blankets and battered tin pots. Migrants, forced out of the southern counties by the drought, squeezed out by men like Vance Sterling and his syndicate, who dammed up the creeks and starved the little folks out. The wagon groaned to a halt as Margot approached the road. She didn't wave, she didn't call out. She just set the 2 buckets down right at the edge of the dust, right on the property line. She took 2 steps back. The father stopped. He looked at the buckets. He looked at Margot. He took off his battered straw hat. He bowed his head just an inch. Margot nodded back. She didn't stay to watch them drink. She didn't wait for a gracias. She didn't stick around to feel good about herself. She just turned around and walked back up the hill toward the barn, empty-handed. Caleb watched the family fall upon the water. The kids drinking from tin cups. The father letting the mule drink from the bucket itself. He watched them until they moved on down the road, leaving the empty wooden buckets in the dust. He looked back toward the tack room. The door was shut. A single lantern glowed in the small window. Caleb understood then. He understood the $4,200. He understood why she wouldn't buy the land but only wanted the water. It wasn't a real estate deal to her. It wasn't business. It was a crusade. She was carrying the weight of people she didn't even know. People who had nothing. People who the law didn't care about. Caleb looked out over his land. His father's land. He thought about the 30 men in town. He thought about the bank. He thought about what it would cost to stand between the syndicate and that spring. It would cost him everything. Caleb went back to the porch. He didn't pick up the bridle. He went to the tool shed instead. The next morning, 4 o'clock. Grace hour. Margot walked out of the tack room, buttoning her cuffs, ready for another day on the fence line. She stopped in the middle of the yard. The old wooden water trough. It had sat by the barn for 20 years. It wasn't there anymore. Margot blinked, looked around, down the hill toward the public road. Caleb was standing there. He was covered in mud, shirt plastered to his back, dirt on his face. He had spent the entire night digging a trench. He had taken the old iron pipes from the ruined irrigation ditch, coupled them together, and run a line from the main pump all the way down the hill. He had dragged the heavy wooden trough 50 yards, anchored it right at the edge of the dirt road, right where the wagons pass. Margot walked slowly down the hill. The pump was chugging. Sweet, cold mineral water was flowing out of the iron pipe, filling the long wooden trough to the brim, spilling over the sides, turning the dry Texas dust into dark, rich mud. It was open, unrestricted, waiting for anyone who came down that road. Caleb was leaning against his shovel, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a wink. Margot stood on the other side of the trough. She looked at the water. She looked at the pipe. Then she looked up at him. She didn't say thank you. She didn't ask why he did it. Words would have ruined it. Words are too small for things like this. Caleb tossed the greasy rag onto the dirt. He picked up his hat, put it on, pulling the brim low over his eyes. "Wire needs stretching on the South 40 today," he said. His voice was rough, gravel and smoke. Margot met his eyes, held them. "I'll get my gloves," she said. That was it. That was the whole conversation. They turned and walked back up the hill side by side. 30 men were coming for them. 30 men with money, guns, and the law in their pockets. But as Caleb walked beside her in the early morning light, he knew something for sure. The line in the sand had been drawn, and he was standing on her side of it. Trouble doesn't blow a bugle before it hits. It just comes wrapped in dust. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. The heat was already baking the color out of the sky. Caleb was up on the barn roof, patching a leak the wind had torn open the night before. Margot was down in the yard, greasing the axle of the heavy freight wagon. Caleb saw the dust trail first, coming from the east, from town, a single rider, moving at a trot. Caleb wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He didn't climb down, he just sat on the pitch of the roof and watched. It was Reed Dunmore. Reed was a banker, a man who wore wool suits in Texas in August because he thought the sweat made him look respectable. He rode a chestnut gelding that was too much horse for him. He pulled up in the yard. His horse was lathered. Reed took off his bowler hat and wiped his forehead with a white linen handkerchief. He looked at Margot, looked at the grease on her hands. Then he looked up at the barn roof. "Caleb," he called out. His voice was thin, scraped dry by the dust. "Reed," Caleb said. He didn't move. "Come down from there. We need to talk." "I can hear you fine from up here." Reed shifted in the saddle. He didn't like having to look up. Men like Reed Dunmore paid good money so they could look down. "It's not bank business, Caleb." "Well, it is, and it isn't." Reed glanced at Margot again. "Maybe we should speak in private." Margot didn't look up. She just kept turning the heavy iron wrench. Clack, clack, clack. "She works here," Caleb said. "Whatever you've got to say to my dirt, you can say to her." Reed sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He climbed down from the horse, tied it to the hitching post. He walked over to the porch, standing in the sliver of shade the overhang provided. Caleb finally climbed down the ladder. He walked over to the water pump, washed his hands, and walked up the porch steps. He didn't offer Reed a seat. "I'm not here for me," Reed said. He kept his voice low. "I'm here for the syndicate, for Vance Sterling." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "Vance has 30 men on his payroll. He couldn't send one of them? Had to send my banker?" "He sent me because I hold your paper," Reed said. He wasn't looking at Caleb now. He was looking at his boots. $4,200, due in under 90 days. "I know the number, Reed. I signed the paper." "Vance knows it, too." Reed looked up. His eyes were wide, frightened. "He knows what she wants, Caleb. He knows why she's here." Over by the wagon, the wrench stopped turning. Margot was listening. "The mineral spring," Reed said. "Vance has been negotiating with the railroad. He's going to bottle that water. Put a spa hotel right over the county line. That spring is the centerpiece of his whole operation. He can't have it turned into a public trust. He can't have a bunch of dirt farmers and Mexicans muddying up the water he's trying to sell to politicians from Austin." "It's my water," Caleb said quietly. "Not for long." Reed stepped closer. "Listen to me. Vance is giving you a way out. One time. He told me to come out here and make you a deal." Caleb didn't blink. "I'm listening." "You put her off this land today. You tear up whatever agreement you have with her. You send her packing back to Santa Fe." Reed swallowed hard. "You do that. And Vance buys your note from my bank, and he burns it." Silence settled over the porch. Heavy. suffocating. "He clears my debt," Caleb said. "Free and clear," Reed urged, his voice pitching up with desperate hope. "You keep the ranch, you keep the arable land, you keep your home, Caleb. Just let the spring go, let her go. It's a fortune he's offering you, more than your father ever saw." "And if I say no?" Reed's face fell. The hope vanished, replaced by a pale, sickly dread. "If you say no, the syndicate squeezes. They squeeze the bank. I'll have to call your note in early on a morals clause. The town will freeze you out. No seed, no supplies, no credit. Vance will starve you out, Caleb. And if you still don't break, he'll send men in the dark." Caleb looked past Reed. He looked out at the dry, cracked earth. He looked at the 40 fence posts he had driven by hand. Then he looked at Margot. She was standing by the wagon now. She was looking right at him. She didn't look scared. She didn't look angry. She just looked waiting. She was giving him the room to betray her. Caleb turned his eyes back to the banker. "Reed." "Yeah, Caleb?" "You're standing on wood my father cut." Caleb pushed off the door frame. He stood tall. "My father wouldn't share shade with a man who talks the way you just did." Reed stepped back. "Caleb, be reasonable. Get on your horse." "You can't fight 30 men, Reed's voice cracked. "She's a stranger. You're throwing away your legacy for a stranger." "She's my hired hand," Caleb said. The words were carved out of granite. "And as long as she's standing on my dirt, she's under my protection. Get on your horse, Reed, before I put you on it." Reed Dunmore looked at Caleb's eyes, and whatever he saw there made him back down the steps. He untied his horse with shaking hands. He climbed into the saddle. "God help you, Caleb," Reed whispered. He spurred the horse and rode away in a cloud of yellow dust. Caleb stood on the porch until the dust settled. The heat was still there. The debt was still there. And now the war was here. He walked down the steps, over to the wagon. Margot was wiping the grease off her hands with a rag. "You should have taken the deal," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I don't make deals with thieves," Caleb said. "They'll destroy you." "They can try." Caleb reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He set it on the wagon bed. "I need you to sign this." Margot looked at the paper. "What is it?" "An employment contract. Formal, legally binding." Caleb looked her in the eye. $8 a month, room and board included, valid for 1 year. "We're going to ride into town this afternoon. We're going to put this in front of the Justice of the Peace. We're going to make it public record." Margot stared at him. She understood what he was doing. He wasn't just turning down the bribe. He was locking his shield to hers. If they wanted her, they had to go through him, through the law, through his name. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The armor in her voice finally cracked, just a little. "Because a man is what he does," Caleb said. "Not what he owns. Get your horse saddled. Your horse. A town turning its back on you doesn't happen with a shout. It happens with a whisper. It happens with the closing of doors." Caleb and Margot rode into Crockett at 2 in the afternoon. The sun was at its most violent. The main street was a wide strip of hard-packed dirt flanked by wooden storefronts. Usually Caleb got a nod from the blacksmith, a tip of the hat from the barber. Not today. Today men looked down at their boots when he rode past. Women pulled their skirts closer and stepped into shops. The silence was louder than a gunshot. Word of his refusal had beaten them to town. The syndicate's shadow was already choking the streets. They tied their horses in front of the Justice of the Peace, went inside, signed the paper. The clerk stamped it without looking either of them in the eye. When they stepped back out into the heat, Caleb pointed down the street. "Finch's Mercantile," he said. "We need flour, coffee, and kerosene. Might be the last time they sell to us. We buy heavy." They walked side by side on the boardwalk, spurs ringing softly against the pine planks. Jacob Finch ran the general store. He was a good man, bowed down by a bad year. The bell above the door jingled as they walked in. The smell of roasted coffee, oiled leather, and peppermint candy hit them. Finch was at the counter, but he wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at a man in a black coat, Doc Miller. Next to Finch was his boy, Henry. 14 years old, skinny, pale. Henry was cradling his right arm against his chest. It was wrapped in dirty linen, and the linen was weeping a foul yellow fluid. The boy had backed into a forge at the blacksmith's 2 weeks ago. "I can't give you any more salve on credit, Jacob," Doc Miller was saying. He sounded tired. "I'm sorry, I really am. But the supplier in Dallas demands cash, $3. That's the cost." "I don't have $3, Doc," Finch said. His voice was thick, ashamed. "The syndicate hasn't paid me for their bulk order yet. Said they're reviewing the ledger. Please, the boy is burning up with fever at night." "Wash it with carbolic soap," Doc Miller said, picking up his black bag. "Keep it clean. I'm sorry, Jacob." Doc Miller turned, saw Caleb and Margot. He gave a stiff nod and walked out the door. Finch looked at Caleb. Then he looked away. "I can't sell to you, Caleb," Finch said quietly. He put an arm around his boy. "Vance Sterling's foreman came by an hour ago. Said if I sell you so much as a box of matches, the syndicate pulls their accounts. I'll go under in a week." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He looked at the shelves full of food. Then he looked at the boy, Henry, shivering in the heat. "I understand, Jacob," Caleb said. It cost him a lot to say it. But he meant it. You can't ask a man to drown just so you can float. Caleb turned to leave. Margot didn't move. She walked up to the counter. She didn't look at Finch. She looked at Henry. "Does it hurt deep or does it hurt on the skin?" she asked. Her voice was incredibly soft, a voice Caleb had never heard her use. "Deep, ma'am," Henry whispered. Margot nodded. She reached inside her heavy canvas coat. She pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. She opened it, reached inside. She placed a silver dollar on the glass counter. Clink. Then another. Clink. Then a 50-cent piece. 2 quarters, $3 exact. "Send for the doctor," Margot said to Finch. "Get the salve." Finch stared at the coins. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. "Ma'am, I can't. If Sterling finds out—" "He won't," Margot said, "because Caleb and I were never here. And you found this money in the pocket of an old winter coat." She didn't wait for a thank you. She turned and walked out the door. Caleb followed her. They rode back to Harding's Hollow in absolute silence. The heat broke just before dusk. A dry wind swept down from the mesa, bringing the temperature down to something a human being could tolerate. After supper, Margot went out to the barn to check the horses. Caleb stayed in the kitchen. He was wiping down the table. That was when he saw it. She had left her coat draped over the back of the chair. The leather pouch she had pulled out at the store had fallen out of the pocket. It was lying on the floor, spilled open. A small black ledger book had tumbled out beside it. Caleb bent down to pick it up. He didn't mean to pry. He just meant to put it back. But the book had fallen open. The pages were covered in neat, precise handwriting. Caleb looked at the page, his eyes locked on the ink. It wasn't a bank ledger. It wasn't a list of investments. It was a list of names. Maria Gonzalez, San Antonio, $1.50. John Redhawk, Taos, $2. Elias Webb, Crockett County, 50 cents. Sarah Jenkins, Fort Stockton, $1 page after page. Name after name. Beside each name was a note. For the water. For the cure. So my daughter can breathe. Caleb's hands went numb. He slowly turned the pages. There were hundreds of names. The amounts were pitiful. Pennies, nickels, quarters, crumpled dollar bills. The sum at the bottom of the last page was circled heavily in dark ink. $4,200. It hit Caleb like a hammer to the chest. She wasn't rich. She wasn't a wealthy eccentric from Santa Fe buying up land for a hobby. She was a vessel. She had traveled across 2 states, knocking on the doors of the poorest, sickest, most broken people in the territory. People who had been driven off their land. People who had been turned away from hospitals. People who remembered the healing water of the spring at Harding's Hollow. They had given her everything they had, their butter money, their shoe money, their winter coal money. They had given it to her to buy the one thing that could save them, to keep it out of the hands of men like Vance Sterling. She was carrying their lives in her pocket. Caleb heard footsteps on the porch. He quickly closed the ledger, tucked it back into the pouch, and slid the pouch back into the coat pocket. Margot walked in. She looked tired. She rubbed her eyes and walked toward the tack room door. "Margot," Caleb said. She stopped, turned around. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the dust in her hair, the bruise on her cheek from a recalcitrant horse, the bandage on her hand from the barbed wire. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," Caleb said. His voice was thick. He swallowed hard. "Just rest well. We've got a lot of fence to mend tomorrow." She nodded, stepped into her room. The door clicked shut. Caleb stood alone in the kitchen. 30 men, 30 rich, powerful, violent men. They wanted her gone. Caleb walked over to his rifle rack above the fireplace. He took down the Winchester. He checked the action, checked the magazine. Then he pulled up a chair, sat facing the front door, and laid the rifle across his knees. "Let them come. Starving a man out takes time. It's not like a gunshot. A bullet is quick. It breaks you all at once. A boycott is different. It's a slow bleed. It takes your pride first, then your energy, then your hope." By the end of the second week, the pantry at Harding's Hollow was showing bare wood. No flour, no sugar, no coffee, just dried beans, some salted pork that was more rind than meat, and cornmeal. Caleb and Margot didn't talk about it. Talking doesn't put food on the table. They just tightened their belts another notch and went to work. But the syndicate didn't stop at the town line. They brought the pressure to the fence. They started sending riders, just 2 or 3 at a time. They wouldn't cross the property line. They'd just sit their horses up on the limestone ridge to the east, watching, silhouettes against the sun, rolling cigarettes, waiting. They wanted Caleb to feel them. Wanted him to look over his shoulder every time he swung a hammer. Wanted Margot to know that out here the law was just a word on a piece of paper in Santa Fe, and a loaded Winchester was the reality. It was a psychological game, and it was exhausting. Thursday night, the heat had finally broken, leaving behind a dry, restless wind. Caleb sat in the kitchen. The house was pitch black. He was saving the kerosene. They had half a gallon left, and when it was gone, they'd be living by moonlight. He was oiling the action of his rifle in the dark. His hands knew the weapon better than they knew his own face. Click, clack, smooth, ready. He heard the squeak of the porch boards. He didn't raise the rifle. He knew her footfalls. Margot had come out of the tack room. She was sitting on the top step of the porch, looking out toward the ridge. It was too dark to see the riders, but they both knew men were out there, camped in the scrub, waiting for Caleb to break, waiting for him to turn to her and say, "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore." Caleb set the rifle on the table. He stood up. He walked over to the corner cabinet, reached up top. He pulled down the big storm lantern, the heavy brass one with the thick glass globe. It was his grandfather's. He only used it for foaling season, or when a storm was bad enough to blow the regular lamps out. He took the kerosene jug, pulled the cork. He poured it in. Not a splash, not a ration. He filled the brass reservoir all the way to the brim, used nearly half of what they had left in the world. He struck a sulfur match against the door frame. The harsh scent of it filled the dark room. He touched the flame to the thick wick, adjusted the dial. The flame leaped up, bright and steady, a brilliant, defiant yellow light. Caleb picked up the lantern by its wire handle. He pushed open the screen door. Margot turned around. She looked at the lantern. Then she looked at his face. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "That's good oil. We need that." "No," Caleb said, "we don't." He walked out onto the porch. He didn't hang it on the wall hook where the light would be blocked by the roof. He walked right to the edge of the steps. He reached up and hung the heavy brass lantern on the outermost wrought iron nail. It swung there, blazing like a miniature sun. It lit up the porch. It lit up the yard. It cast long, sharp shadows out toward the dirt road and the ridge beyond. It made a perfect target of the house. "Caleb," Margot said. There was a warning in her voice, and something else, a tremor she was trying to hide. Caleb sat down on the wooden planks about 3 feet from her. He leaned his forearms on his knees. He looked out into the dark. "Men hide when they're scared," Caleb said. His voice was a low rumble. "They turn out the lights. They pull the shades. They hope the wolf passes the door." He turned his head, looked right at her. The lantern light caught the hard angles of his jaw, the dark intensity in his eyes. "I'm not hiding," he said. Let them see the house. Let them see us. Let them know we're awake and we're not going anywhere." Margot stared at him. The wind caught a stray lock of her hair, blowing it across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. For the first time since she rode into Harding's Hollow, the armor cracked, just a fraction. She looked at the bright, burning lantern. Then she looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. "I brought this to your door," she whispered. It was the closest thing to an apology he had ever heard from her. "You had a life here, a hard one maybe, but it was yours. Now, you're starving in the dark for a fight that isn't yours." Caleb didn't answer right away. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out his tobacco pouch and a paper. He rolled a cigarette with slow, deliberate movements, tucked it into the corner of his mouth. He leaned over, opened the glass door of the lantern just a crack, and lit the tip of his cigarette from the wick. Shut the glass. He took a drag, blew the smoke out into the Texas night. "My father," Caleb said, his voice quiet, "taught me a lot of things. How to break a horse, how to sink a well, how to read the sky for rain." He looked at the burning tip of his cigarette. "But he never taught me how to look the other way." He shifted on the hard wood, turning his body slightly more toward her. "The fight's here, Margot. It was always going to come here. Vance Sterling and his 30 men. They don't stop. If it wasn't the spring today, it'd be the grazing land tomorrow. Men like that don't know how to be neighbors. They only know how to be masters." He took another slow drag. "You didn't bring the fight to my door. You just gave me a reason to finally step out and meet it." Margot didn't say anything. She couldn't. She just drew her knees up a little closer to her chest. And for the rest of the night they sat there on the porch, together, not talking, just watching the perimeter. The lantern burned bright and steady against the dark. A beacon. A challenge. Out on the ridge the watchers saw the light. They didn't fire a shot. They didn't ride down. Because a man sitting in the dark is prey. But a man who lights a fire in the open is a hunter waiting for you to make a mistake. And as the night wore on, the distance between Caleb and Margot on that wooden porch felt a lot shorter than 3 feet. Morning brought a heavy, suffocating heat. The wind had died completely. Margot had taken the wagon to the north pasture to check the spring's flow. Caleb stayed back to fix a snapped harness strap. He walked into the tack room. It smelled like old leather, neatsfoot oil, and dust, and something else now. Something floral, faint, soap, maybe, her smell. He didn't like being in her space when she wasn't there. It felt like trespassing. He found the heavy leather awl on the workbench and turned to leave. His boot caught the edge of a loose floorboard. He stumbled, reached out to catch his balance against a stack of wooden crates. The crates shifted. A small, unvarnished cedar box slid off the top crate and hit the dirt floor. It didn't break, but the brass latch popped open. Caleb knelt down to pick it up. He intended to snap it shut and put it right back. But his eyes caught what was inside. He froze. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't money. It wasn't a deed. It was a piece of root. Sage root. Dried out. Brittle. Gray with age. But it wasn't just pulled from the ground. It was braided. 3 thin strands of root, woven together with meticulous care, tied off at the ends with a piece of faded red string. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. A slow, heavy thud. He reached out, picked up the braided root. It felt weightless in his palm. He had seen this before. Not something like it. He had seen this exact knot. The way the red string was looped twice and pulled under itself. His father, Thomas Harding, had kept a small iron lockbox under his bed. When he died, Caleb had opened it to find the will. But next to the will, there had been a braided piece of sage root tied with faded red string, exactly like this one. His father had never explained it, never mentioned it, but he had kept it locked up with the deed to the ranch. Caleb stared at the root in his hand. Then he looked at the cedar box. He placed the root back inside, closed the latch, set it back on the crate exactly where it had been. He didn't fix the harness. He walked out of the barn, saddled his roan gelding, and rode south toward the creek bed. He didn't take the main road. He took the dry wash that snaked behind the limestone ridge, keeping out of sight of the syndicate's watchers. He was going to see Silas Poole. Silas's smithy sat 2 miles outside of town, nestled against a stand of dying cottonwoods. Silas was 71 years old. He had a back like a bent crowbar and hands that looked like cured jerky. He had been shoeing horses in Crockett County before there was a town to name. Caleb rode up, tied his horse, walked into the heat of the forge. Silas was pumping the bellows. The coals roared bright orange. He looked up at Caleb, didn't smile, didn't frown, just let go of the bellows. "You're a long way from home, boy," Silas rasped, "especially for a man who's got 30 wolves circling his porch." "I need an answer, Silas. And I figure you're the only man old enough and honest enough to give it to me." Silas wiped his hands on a filthy leather apron. He walked over to a water barrel, used a tin cup to take a drink, swished it around, spat it on the dirt floor. "Ask." Caleb reached into his pocket. He had brought his father's lockbox before he left the house. He pulled out the braided sage root, held it out in his flat palm. "I found another one of these," Caleb said. "Identical, same braid, same red string. Belongs to the woman staying at my place, Margot Calloway, from Santa Fe." Silas stopped moving. His eyes dropped to Caleb's palm. For a long time, the only sound was the hiss of the dying coals. Silas slowly reached out. He touched the faded red string with a thick, calloused finger. "Calloway," Silas whispered. It sounded like a prayer or a curse. "What is it, Silas?" Caleb demanded. His voice was tight. "My father kept this locked up like it was gold. Who is she? What does this mean?" Silas turned his back. He walked over to the anvil, leaned heavy against it. "It means you don't know a damn thing about the dirt you're standing on, Caleb." The old man took a deep breath. 1871, Silas began, staring into the ash. Long before the railroad. Long before Vance Sterling wore a suit. We had a wet spring, too wet, flooded the creeks, mixed the latrines with the drinking water down by the border camps. Silas looked over his shoulder. Cholera. The word hung in the hot air. It hit the Mexican camps first, then the indigenous folks out west. The town council. They panicked. They shut the borders of Crockett, put armed men on the roads, banned anyone sick from coming to the town hospital, left them out there in the mud to die. Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "There was a woman," Silas said softly. "Lived out near Santa Fe, but she was passing through. A healer. Used herbs, clean water, old ways. Name was Alma. Alma Calloway." Caleb's breath hitched. Margot's grandmother. "Alma begged the town to let them use the hospital," Silas continued. "They threatened to hang her, so she went looking for a place with clean, deep water, water that didn't come from the tainted creeks." Silas turned around and faced Caleb full on. "She came to Harding's Hollow. She asked your father for the Northern Spring." Caleb stared. "My father?" "Thomas knew what it meant," Silas said. "He knew if he let infected people onto his land, the town would turn on him. He knew he'd be branded a traitor to his own kind." "Did he do it?" Caleb asked. Silas nodded slowly. "He didn't just do it. He stood at the edge of his property with a shotgun and told the county sheriff to go to hell. For 2 months, Alma Calloway and Thomas Harding turned that spring into a hospital. They bathed the sick. They boiled the clothes. They buried the dead. Together." Silas pointed a trembling finger at the sage root in Caleb's hand. "When it was over, when the sickness broke, Alma braided 2 pieces of sage root. Native tradition. Means 2 lives bound by a single truth. She kept one. She gave the other to Thomas, and then she rode away." Silas walked over and gripped Caleb's shoulder. His hand was remarkably strong. The town never forgave him, Caleb. They couldn't run him off because he was too tough, but they never forgave him. That's why he was always isolated. That's why he struggled. Caleb looked down at the root in his hand. His vision blurred for a second. "She didn't just stumble onto my ranch," Caleb whispered. "Margot?" "No," Silas said. "She came back to finish her grandmother's work, to secure the water, for good." Caleb walked out of the forge. He didn't say goodbye. He just swung up onto his saddle and spurred his horse toward home. He rode hard, the wind whipping his face. The pieces fell together with a deafening crash. The ledger of donations, the quiet dignity, the refusal to back down. Margot wasn't a stranger. She was the inheritor of a sacred pact. And he wasn't just protecting a woman he had hired. He was holding the line his father had drawn in the dirt 13 years ago. When Caleb crested the ridge and saw Harding's Hollow below, the ranch looked different. It didn't look like a failing piece of real estate anymore. It looked like a fortress. And he was ready to die on its walls. The syndicate didn't come with a declaration of war. They came with wire cutters and arsenic. It started on a Tuesday. Caleb rode out to the south pasture and found a quarter-mile of his new fence laid flat. Not blown down. Cut. The wire clipped neatly between every mesquite post, coiling in the dirt like dead snakes. It took him and Margot 2 full days to restring it. 2 days working in the blistering heat, looking over their shoulders. Then came Thursday. Caleb walked to the secondary well, the one near the house that they used for washing and the horses. He pumped the handle. The water didn't run clear. It ran milky, and it smelled like bitter almonds and dead earth. Poison. Caleb stared at the milky puddle soaking into the dust. He didn't curse. He didn't throw the bucket. He just walked to the barn, took a heavy iron padlock, and chained the pump handle down so the horses wouldn't drink from it by mistake. The circle was tightening. Vance Sterling was sending a message. "I can touch your fences. I can touch your water. I can reach right into your yard while you sleep." That evening, the sky bruised a deep, unnatural purple. The air grew heavy, thick enough to chew. The wind stopped dead. Even the crickets went silent. Out here, when the prairie goes quiet, you listen. It means something violent is coming. Margot stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the sky. Caleb was sitting at the table. He was wrapping a clean rag around his right hand. The barbed wire had slipped that morning. Took a chunk of skin off his knuckles. He tied the knot with his teeth. "Storm's breaking tonight," Caleb said. He didn't look up. "Gonna be a bad one." Margot didn't answer right away. She watched a fork of dry lightning crack over the mesa, silent and jagged. "They're going to kill you, Caleb," she said quietly. Caleb tested the bandage on his hand, flexed his fingers. "They haven't yet. Because they're playing with you." Margot finally turned away from the window. She looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. She saw the hollows in his cheeks from 2 weeks of half rations. "Sterling isn't going to let this go to the courts," she said. Her voice was trembling, not from fear for herself. "He knows what I'm carrying. He knows if I get those papers to the Supreme Court in Santa Fe, the federal government takes the spring. It becomes a public trust. He loses." She walked over to the table. She placed her hands flat on the scarred oak. "He can't let me leave this county with those papers. But he knows he can't get to me while you're standing in the way." Caleb met her eyes. "Then I keep standing." "Until when?" Her voice broke. "Until they burn the barn with the horses inside? Until they put a bullet through this window while you're drinking your coffee? Caleb, you owe me nothing. You owe this town nothing. Let me go." "I told you before," Caleb said, his voice dropping to that low, steady rumble. "You're under my protection. Your protection is a death sentence for us both." Caleb stood up. He was taller than her, broader, but he didn't crowd her. He just stood there, steady as a post. "I know who you are, Margot," he said. She froze. "I went to Silas," Caleb continued. "I showed him the braided sage root. I know about your grandmother. I know about 1871. I know what my father did." Margot's breath caught in her throat. She looked away, staring at the floorboards. "This isn't just about a spring," Caleb said gently. "It's about finishing what they started. If you run now, they win. They take the water. They bleed the people who need it. I'm not letting that happen." "If I stay, you die," Margot whispered. "I can't let that happen either." Thunder rattled the windows, a deep, bone-shaking boom that rolled across the valley. The first drops of rain hit the tin roof, hard, heavy, sounding like handfuls of gravel. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. "We've got a long day tomorrow. Mud's going to be thick." He walked past her, heading toward the front room to take his post by the door with the rifle. Margot watched him go. The rain started coming down in sheets, drowning out the sound of his boots. She walked to the tack room. She didn't light the lamp. She sat on the edge of her cot in the dark, listening to the rain hammer the roof. She thought about the faces of the people who had given her their last crumpled dollars. She thought about her grandmother, standing alone against a terrified town. And she thought about Caleb, a man who asked no questions, demanded no praise, and was willing to throw away his life for a fight he didn't start. She couldn't stay. If she stayed, Sterling's men would eventually catch them sleeping. They would burn Harding's Hollow to the ground. Caleb would die defending her. But if she ran, if she slipped out into the storm, the syndicate's watchers on the ridge would see her go. They wouldn't care about the ranch anymore. They would follow the papers. They would follow her. She would draw the wolves away from his door. Margot reached under her mattress. She pulled out the heavy leather pouch with the public trust documents and the ledger of names. She shoved it into her saddlebag. She didn't pack her clothes. She didn't pack food. Travel light. Travel fast. She waited until the storm hit its peak, until the thunder was a constant deafening roar and the wind was howling through the cracks in the barn. She slipped out the back door. The rain soaked her instantly. It was cold, blinding. She moved through the mud to the barn, saddled her mare by feel in the pitch black. She wrapped the reins around her wrist. She led the horse out the back double doors, facing west, away from the house, toward the New Mexico border. She stopped, looked back at the dark silhouette of the ranch house. She couldn't say goodbye. If he woke up, he would stop her. "Keep the dirt, Cowboy," she whispered to the storm. She swung up into the saddle, kicked the mare into a hard gallop, and vanished into the rain. Caleb woke to the smell of ozone and wet earth. The storm had passed. The morning light was gray and thin, filtering through the cracks in the window shutters. He was stiff. He had fallen asleep in the chair by the front door, the Winchester resting across his lap. He stood up, stretched his back. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He walked to the kitchen, put the coffee on. Out of habit, he reached for 2 tin cups. He looked toward the tack room. The door was slightly ajar. Caleb stopped. He walked over, pushed the door open. The bed was made. The saddlebags were gone. Her heavy canvas coat was missing from the peg on the wall. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long time. The silence in the room was heavier than the storm had been. He didn't run out to the yard. He didn't shout her name. He knew she wasn't there. He knew exactly why she had done it. She had made herself bait. Caleb walked out to the porch. He looked up at the limestone ridge. The watchers were gone. No horses. No silhouettes against the morning sky. They had seen her ride out. They were following her. 30 men hunting one woman across the open plains. A cold, hard knot formed in Caleb's chest. He had promised to protect her, and she had taken that choice away from him to save his life. He walked to the barn. His roan gelding was there, shifting nervously in its stall. Caleb went to the back wall to grab his heavy riding slicker. The roof had leaked badly during the storm. A steady drip of water was falling directly onto his father's old wooden toolbox, pooling on the lid. Caleb swore softly. He grabbed a rag and wiped the water off the heavy oak box. He flipped the brass latches to check if the tools inside had rusted. The box was full of heavy iron wrenches, farrier tools, and old horseshoes. Caleb began pulling them out, drying them off one by one. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas, was a flat tin. Caleb frowned. He hadn't seen this since he was a boy. He thought his father had lost it years ago. He unwrapped the canvas, popped the lid off the tin. Inside was a folded piece of heavy parchment, yellowed with age. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Strong, slanted, his father's hand. It was the third page of the will. When Thomas Harding had died, the lawyer in town had only given Caleb 2 pages, the official legal transfer of the deed and the debts. Caleb never knew there was a third. He unfolded it carefully. The paper felt fragile. "To my son, Caleb," the letter began. "If you are reading this, the land is yours. But the dirt does not belong to the name Harding." Caleb leaned against the workbench. The light from the barn door caught the dust motes dancing in the air. "I bought this land with money, but I earned the right to stand on it in 1871. I earned it by opening the gates when the town told me to close them. I earned it by sharing the water with people who had none." Caleb's eyes traced the fading ink. His heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. "Harding's Hollow is only a ranch if you use it to feed yourself, but it is a sanctuary if you use it to heal others. That is the condition of this dirt. It does not belong to the strong, it belongs to those who need it to survive. There will come a day when men with money and guns try to take it from you. They will offer you gold. They will threaten your life. They will tell you that the law is on their side. If you sell it to the strong so they may crush the weak, you are no son of mine. The land will reject you, the water will dry up, and you will be a ghost on your own property. Hold the line, Caleb. The water must stay free. Protect the ones who carry the burden. That is your inheritance, not the dirt, the duty. Thomas." Caleb lowered the paper. He looked around the barn. He looked out the doors at the rolling acres of Texas scrub, still wet from the rain. He had spent the last 3 months trying to figure out how to save his ranch, how to pay off the bank, how to keep the title in his name. He had been fighting the wrong war. It wasn't about the deed. It was about the duty. Vance Sterling didn't want the land. He wanted the power to control who lived and who died. And Margot was out there right now, riding alone, carrying the only piece of paper that could strip that power away from him forever. Caleb folded the letter. He slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He didn't hesitate anymore. He threw the heavy saddle onto the roan, cinched the girth tight. He slid his Winchester into the saddle scabbard. He checked the cylinder of his Colt revolver. 6 rounds, full. He led the horse out into the muddy yard. He looked back at the house one last time. The porch where they had sat. The lantern still hanging on the nail, its oil burned completely dry. If he rode out now, he might never come back. The bank would foreclose, the ranch would be gone. Caleb pulled himself up into the saddle. "It's just dirt," he said aloud. He spurred the horse. He didn't ride toward town. He didn't ride toward the bank to beg for time. He turned the horse west, toward the canyonlands, toward the New Mexico border. He rode hard, following the deep, fresh tracks her mare had left in the mud. He rode to catch the storm. A box canyon is a bad place to make a stand. It's a dead end carved out of red rock. The walls go straight up. There is no back door. Margot's mare was blowing hard, sides heaving, lathered in white sweat. She pulled back on the reins. The horse danced sideways, hooves clattering against loose shale. She was trapped. The dust trail she had been out running for 3 hours finally caught up to her. They poured into the mouth of the canyon. Men on horseback, men with rifles resting on their saddles. 30 of them. They fanned out, forming a half circle, blocking the only way out. Vance Sterling rode in last. He didn't look like the rest of them. No dust on his coat, no sweat on his brow. He wore a silver-belly Stetson and a tailored wool suit. He looked like a man walking into a bank, not a canyon. Sterling pulled his gray gelding to a halt in the center of the line. He raised a gloved hand. The 30 men stopped. The only sound was the jingling of bits and the heavy breathing of horses. "It's a long ride to Santa Fe, Miss Calloway," Sterling called out. His voice was polite, cultured. That made it worse. Margot didn't answer. She kept her right hand resting on the heavy leather saddlebag. "You ran a good race," Sterling continued. "But the territory is vast, and you are entirely alone. Hand over the saddlebag. Turn your horse around. And I will personally guarantee your safe passage to the nearest train station." "And if I don't?" Margot asked. Her voice didn't shake. Sterling smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Then you had a terrible accident in the Badlands, a tragic fall. These things happen." 30 rifle hammers clicked back. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like dry bones snapping. Margot looked at the line of men. She looked at the saddlebag. Hundreds of names, thousands of pennies. The weight of it felt heavier than lead. She took a breath, prepared to kick her mare into a hopeless charge. Then another sound, not from the canyon mouth, from the ridge above. A single piece of shale skittered down the rock face. Sterling looked up. The 30 men looked up. A rider was silhouetted against the morning sun, sitting atop a big roan gelding. Caleb. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He just pointed the roan down the steep, treacherous goat path that dropped into the canyon. The horse slid on its haunches, kicking up a cloud of red dust, navigating a drop that no sane man would ride. But Caleb didn't break. He rode the slide all the way to the canyon floor. He trotted right through the line of Sterling's men. They were too stunned to stop him. He pulled up right next to Margot. He looked at her horse, looked at her. "You take a terrible shortcut," Caleb said softly. Margot let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "I told you to keep the dirt. Never was good at listening." Caleb turned his horse around. He put himself between Margot and the 30 men. Sterling's polite smile vanished. His face went hard. "You're out of your depth, Harding," Sterling spat. "You came all this way to die for a woman you barely know?" Caleb rested his hands on the pommel of his saddle. "I know her well enough," Caleb said. "I have 30 guns pointing at you." Sterling gestured to his men. "You have 1 rifle in your scabbard. I will ask you one last time. Step aside. Give us the papers, and you can keep your miserable piece of dirt." Caleb didn't reach for his Winchester. He didn't reach for the Colt on his hip. He reached into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. It had a red wax seal broken at the top. "You know what this is, Vance?" Caleb asked. Sterling narrowed his eyes. "I don't care what it is." "It's the original deed to Harding's Hollow," Caleb said. His voice carried steady and clear. "Signed by the territorial governor in 1852. Caleb reached into his vest, pulled out a match. He struck it against his saddle horn. It flared to life. Margot watched, wide-eyed. "Caleb, no." "The bank holds my note," Caleb said, looking right at Sterling. $4,200, but they don't hold the deed. I do. It's private property as long as this piece of paper exists." He touched the match to the corner of the heavy parchment. The dry paper caught instantly. Sterling stiffened. "Harding, stop." Caleb let it burn. The flames licked up toward his fingers. "You kill us," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, "and you bury this deed. You know what happens to private land when the owner dies intestate, with no deed and an unresolved bank lien?" Sterling's face went pale. The men behind him shifted uneasily. Most of them were hired guns, but a few were cattlemen. They knew the law. "It defaults," Caleb said. He dropped the burning paper onto the red dirt. They all watched it turn to black ash. "It defaults to the federal government," Caleb finished. "It becomes a disputed federal asset, United States property." The canyon was dead silent. Caleb looked at the 30 men. "You shoot me," Caleb said, "and you aren't dealing with a corrupt county sheriff anymore. You're dealing with the United States Marshals. You're dealing with federal judges in Washington. You'll have an army of federal surveyors sitting on that spring for the next 10 years trying to untangle the claim." He pointed a finger at Sterling. "You pull that trigger, Vance, and you lose the water. Forever. It gets locked up in federal court, and your railroad deal dies today." Sterling sat frozen. His fists clenched so tight his leather gloves creaked. He was trapped. Caleb hadn't brought an army. He had brought the one thing Vance Sterling couldn't buy and couldn't shoot: the federal government. Caleb shifted in his saddle. He looked at the line of hired guns. "I don't have a deed anymore," Caleb said. I don't have a ranch. I just have a horse and the woman standing behind me." He rested his hand on his thigh, inches from his revolver. "She stays," Caleb said. The words hit like hammer strikes. "The water stays free. Now turn your horses around and ride out of my canyon." Sterling's breathing was heavy. He looked at the black ash on the ground. He looked at Caleb's eyes. He saw a man who had already lost everything. A man who had absolutely nothing left to fear. Sterling jerked his reins. His gray gelding spun around. "Let's go," Sterling snapped. "Boss?" one of the gunmen asked, confused. "I said let's go," Sterling roared. He spurred his horse and rode back out the way he came. One by one, the 30 men lowered their rifles. They turned their horses. They followed the dust of their boss, riding back out onto the plains. Within 5 minutes, the canyon was empty. The only sound was the wind. Caleb sat in the saddle for a long time, watching the dust settle. Then he felt a hand on his arm. He turned. Margot had ridden up beside him. She looked down at the pile of black ash. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were bright, shining. "You burned it," she whispered. "You burned your home." Caleb reached out. He placed his hand over hers. "No," Caleb said. "I just burned the paper. The dirt is still there. We just have to go to Santa Fe and buy it back." Santa Fe is a city built on old ghosts and new laws. It took them 4 days to get there. They didn't push the horses. They didn't look over their shoulders. The syndicate was broken. The threat of a federal inquiry had scattered Sterling's investors like quail. They walked into the Supreme Court building on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a grand ceremony. There were no crowds, no speeches, just a tired clerk with ink on his fingers and a massive leather-bound ledger. Margot placed the saddlebag on the mahogany counter. She pulled out the thick stack of petitions. And she poured the coins out. Pennies, nickels, quarters, crumpled dollars, $4,200 worth of pure, hard-fought hope. The clerk counted it all. It took him 2 hours. When he was done, he stamped the documents. The Northern Spring at Harding's Hollow was officially a public water trust, in perpetuity, unrestricted, belonging to no man, and available to all. Then Caleb stepped up. He used the remaining balance of the trust, the overage Margot had collected from the people, to pay off the lien on the rest of the land. The clerk drafted a new deed. He dipped his pen, looked up at them. "Name on the title?" the clerk asked. Caleb didn't speak. He looked at Margot. She took the pen. She signed her name, Margot Calloway. Then she passed the pen to him. Caleb signed right beneath her. Caleb Harding. 2 names, bound by a single piece of paper, bound by a single truth. They walked out of the courthouse together. The New Mexico sun was bright and warm. Caleb put his hat on. Margot adjusted her coat. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. They walked side by side, their shoulders brushing. They had a long ride home. 2 months later. Harding's Hollow. The weather was turning. The nights were getting cool. Caleb was in the barn, oiling a harness. Silas Poole rode into the yard. The old blacksmith didn't get off his mule. He just sat there looking at the house. Caleb walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Silas, you need water? The trough is full." "No," Silas rasped. "I brought you something. Found it clearing out the back of my shop. Been sitting under an anvil for 30 years. Silas reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small book, bound in cracked, dry leather. He tossed it down to Caleb. Caleb caught it. "What's this?" Caleb asked. "Journal," Silas said. "Belonged to a man named Elias Webb. He was here in 1851, before your daddy, before the railroad." Caleb opened the book. The pages were brittle. "Webb had the same idea your lady friend had," Silas said. He leaned forward on the saddle horn. "He found that spring, wanted to keep it open, wanted to heal folks." Caleb looked up. "What happened to him?" 30 men happened," Silas said. His voice was heavy with the weight of the past. "Same kind of men as Vance Sterling, different names, same greed." They cut his fences, poisoned his dogs, starved him out. He broke, sold the land for pennies and walked away. Silas pointed a crooked finger at Caleb. It's a cycle, boy. Men with money come. They take. The good folks run. It happened to Webb. It happened to your daddy. It almost happened to you. The old man smiled. A rare, genuine thing. But you broke it. You stood. I just thought you ought to know. You didn't just save yourselves. You settled a debt for Elias Webb and for Thomas and for Alma. Silas picked up his reins. See you in town, Caleb. The old man rode away. Caleb stood in the yard. He looked down at the old leather journal. The land remembers. It remembers the blood spilled on it. It remembers the tears. And it remembers the ones who refused to leave. August, 1885. 1 year later. August in Crockett County isn't a month. It's an anvil. The heat beat down on the earth. The dirt cracked in perfectly straight parallel lines, but things were different now. Down by the public road, a heavy freight wagon was stopped. A family of dirt farmers headed south. The father was pumping the iron handle. The water flowed cold and clear into the long wooden trough. The horses drank deeply. The children splashed the water on their faces, laughing in the brutal heat. Up on the western ridge, 40 fence posts stood in a perfectly straight line. None of them were leaning. None of the wire was cut. Caleb walked along the fence line. He wasn't carrying a rifle today. He was just carrying a hammer, checking the staples. He reached the last post. He set the hammer down. He placed his hand flat against the hot, rough wood, checking the plumb. It was dead straight. He heard footsteps behind him, soft, steady. Margot walked up. She wasn't wearing her heavy canvas coat today, just a light cotton shirt, sleeves rolled up. Her face was tanned. She looked like she belonged to the dirt now. She didn't say anything. She just stepped up to the fence post. She raised her hand, and she placed it flat against the wood right next to his. Their hands didn't touch, but the space between them was filled with a quiet, unbreakable strength. Caleb looked at her hand. Then he looked out over the land. It wasn't a piece of real estate anymore. It wasn't a debt. It was a home, and she was staying. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss more unforgettable Western tales. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
What made this story unforgettable is that love here was never loud, never easy, and never selfish. It was built in silence, proven in danger, and sealed by two people who chose each other through action, long before they ever spoke their hearts aloud. This channel is devoted to stories of the Western frontier, cowboy spirit, Western romance, a mother's sacrifice, human kindness, tenderness among the broken, and the quiet compassion that shines brightest in hard lives. Out here in the West, the story never really ends when the guns go quiet, or when the dust finally settles. It lingers in the land, in the silence between two people, in the water that keeps flowing long after the fight is over. And what we witnessed in this story was never just a conflict over a spring, or a ranch, or even a debt owed to a bank. It was something deeper, something older than law, older than ownership, older even than the names written on a deed. It was a story about what a person chooses to stand for when everything they have can be taken away. Caleb Harding began as a man trying to survive. That's all most men out here ever aim for. Keep your land. Keep your cattle. Keep your name from being buried under someone else's boots. But survival alone is a small kind of living, and the West has a way of asking more from a man than he thinks he can give. When Margot rode into his life, she didn't just bring trouble, she brought truth. The kind of truth that forces a man to look at himself and decide what he is worth, when there's no one watching, when there's no reward waiting at the end. And what Caleb chose was not safety, not comfort, not even legacy in the way most men understand it. He chose duty, not the kind written in law books or stamped with official seals, but the kind that lives in the bones. The kind passed down in silence, from father to son, from one generation to the next. A duty to protect something that cannot defend itself. A duty to stand between power and the powerless. A duty to say no, even when every voice around you tells you to bend, to sell, to walk away. And Margot, she carried a different kind of weight. Not land, not cattle, not a family name tied to a place. She carried people, invisible people, forgotten people, the kind the world steps over without noticing. Every coin in her pouch wasn't just money. It was trust. It was hope. It was a quiet belief that somewhere, somehow, there was still a place in this world where kindness could win. She could have walked away. She could have handed over the papers, saved herself the danger, spared herself the burden. But she didn't. Because some people don't measure life by what they gain, but by what they refuse to lose. And when those two kinds of people meet, the one who protects and the one who carries, the world shifts, even if just a little. That is the heart of this story.